Dear fathers, brothers and sisters, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today with you and to be able to share some of facts and information with regards to our patriarch Saint Tikhon, who indeed was a man of great virtues, of great spiritual strength, although externally he would not, at the initial, meeting with him, he would not look like a person that would be so strong and so resistant to the attempt to succumb the church to whatever ideas that were being implemented at that time, and that it's very remarkable that such a person appeared in the scene of the Russian Church when really he was needed the most, I guess. So I'll just start by going through some of the slides that I prepared for you, and then in the end, I guess, if anybody will have any certain type of questions, we can try and address them. So, as with every person, we'll start off by looking at the biography of the future patriarch. So if you can move on to the next slide. We know that Patriarch Tikhon, his name was Vasily when he was born. He was born on January 19th in 1865. In the small, well, you cannot really call it a town per se. It was more of even smaller than a town in Torpets, Klin, which was named Klin, in Torpets district in the Pskov region, and he was born into a family of a priest, Ioann Timofeyevich Belavin, and his mother, Anna Gavrilovna Belavina, which his father was a priest in generation, basically. So, and he already had two brothers at that time, Pavel Ivanovich Belavin and Ioann Ivanovich Belavin, who already were obviously his brothers, and being raised in the strict tradition, in the Christian tradition of Orthodox Russian Church, and through his childhood, Vasily was recognized as a very humble, as a very kind and thoughtful child. And then later on they had to move actually from Klin to a different, so his father was assigned to serve in a different church, and at that new place his younger brother Mikhail Ivanovich Belavin, he was born there, and it was quite remarkable to learn that unfortunately among all of the brothers, Vasily lived the longest despite the whole turbulence that he had to go through. And there was an interesting story about his father having a dream in which he saw his mother, so Vasily's grandmother, in which she kind of was foretelling the father that he would die soon, and that amongst the children that he has, Vasily would have the brightest future, and that he will be like a shining beam of light, while the other brothers would not live long. And this is how it actually ended up being, with Pavel graduating from Pskov Theological Seminary and St. Petersburg Institute. He was a teacher of Latin, but he didn't live long. Similarly, Ioann Ivanovich Belavin was teaching the God's Law in Torpets parish school, and his younger brother, actually Michael, who was made to become his like a personal assistant and a librarian, he would accompany future Bishop Tikhon. He would also pass away quite young. So this would be the story, the short story of the family of Belavins. So if you can go on to the next page. So as I already mentioned, Vasily was quite a bright boy, and that his brightness obviously was demonstrated through the success in his studies. So he finished Torpets Theological School in 1878, moved on to Pskov Theological Seminary in 1884, and after graduating from the latter at the age of 19, he was able to enter St. Petersburg Theological Academy. It was quite also remarkable because normally only pupils at the age of 20 would be accepted into the academy, but because of his success in his studies, he was accepted at the age of 19. And as I already mentioned, that his friends, his fellow students would consider him to be a very kind and supportive and helpful person. There was a story in seminary because Vasily had a very nice fur coat, and because other children would not be in the possession of such an item and be a bit more poor than him, he would gladly share his fur coat with them in order so they can go somewhere and to make some things. And sometimes there would be confusion when his fellow students would be looking outside the window and seeing Vasily's fur coat, and they would ask, well, where is Vasily headed off to? And the guys would be saying, well, nowhere. There he sits in the corner, minding his own business. And the friends would then respond with saying something, well, this is remarkable. Vasily is here and his coat is walking on its own somewhere else. And by seeing his kindness, by seeing the way he is being quite open-hearted, he's being wise, meek, they would call him, by a playful nickname, Bishop in the seminary. And actually in academy, people started to calling him Patriarch, although Patriarch obviously has been abolished in 1721. So it was not common, and there was no reason for him to be called like that. And there was also an interesting situation in the academy when normally the academy library would be ran by students. So the students would elect a single person, and he would be considered a librarian, and that post would be held until the next election. And there was a bit of a conflict inside the academy, so the rector would dismiss the existing librarian, and the students would be really upset of it, because technically rector was not supposed to do this type of things. And when the rector selected Vasily for this role, basically they had to agree, because everybody had a great respect for Vasily. So if we can go to the next slide. So after graduation from the academy in 1888, he moved back to Pskov to work as a theological seminary as a teacher. He was teaching certain theological disciplines, and also the French language to the students. And it was some time before Vasily decided to dedicate himself fully to the serving of church. He spent at least 3 years considering the question. It's also was mentioned that he was in a relationship, but it didn't really work out. So after this, in 1891, he filed a request to be tonsured, and that what happened. He was tonsured and ordained in the Church of Three Hierarchs by Bishop Hermogen of Pskov and Pokrov. And it was quite an interesting situation. The church was situated on the second floor of the building, and because there were so many people who wanted to be involved and to witness this occasion, they had to bring special, like artificial columns to support the floor from underneath, so it would not collapse. So after his ordination, he was assigned as an inspector in the Home Theological Seminary in Lublin, but he didn't really spend a lot of time there, because he was promoted to rector and then moved to Kazan Theological Seminary, where he was elevated to the rank of archimandrite, but then again moved back as a rector of Home Theological Seminary in Lublin. He was involved in construction of church of Saint Theodosius of Chernigov in there, and then after spending some time, he was ordained as Bishop of Lublin and appointed a vicar bishop to Archbishop Flavian. There was an interesting situation also, and that was coming later when Vladika was actually moved on to receive his own cathedra that one of the people that was kind of involved in the farewells, he said it was amazing. I was able to see a human bishop, human-like bishop for the first time in my life, meaning that the way that Vladika behaved, the way he would meet people, the way that he would address them would be not so common, I guess, coming from a person from such a high rank. And when Vladika was actually ordained as bishop, he said the following words: "Now I understand that the episcopacy is first and foremost not power, honor, and authority, but work, labor, and achievement. And the true life of a bishop is a constant dying from worries, labors, and sorrows." And these statements, these are his words during the sermon once he was ordained. These words basically became his banner throughout his following years of service. And this is how he acted on a daily basis. So if we can go to the next page. So after that, Vladika, there was a slight conflict with him being a vicar, because when he was a vicar, he had obviously to oversee some of the churches and some of the monasteries. And in one of the monastery, there was a situation where Mother Elizabeth, I believe was her name, there was some discrepancy between the documentation of the way everything was kind of looked after from the financial standpoint of view, and Vladika was able to find it out, to witness it, and there was a small conflict that kind of grew, and because everybody has their own support, Mother Elizabeth also had support in St. Petersburg, and the best thing that it was considered then to do in order to suppress the situation is to promote Vladika Tikhon to his own cathedral. So this is how from home he was moved as far as the North America, and this is how the page of his life, where the mission in America was carried out from 1898 to 1907. And Vladika, of course, coming to this diocese, was able to witness and experience a lot of different challenges. First of all, the Holy Synod stopped paying the support finances to the mission in America. So when Vladika came there, he didn't really have any extra money to be able to support his work. So he really had to try and find the funds and to overcome all of the burdens all by himself. And a man in his position, the first thing he actually does in the first year, he commits a missionary journey onto Alaska, the northern Alaska, from San Francisco, that took up approximately 78 days and covered 11,000 kilometers in distance. And he had to go by water, by ships, and then in kayaks, and to meet the flock, the Aleuts, the Indians, the Eskimos, who were living there, and the people there were living in great poverty, and they were also quite prone to various diseases and epidemics. And it was very interesting to learn that despite all of that, Vladika would try and visit every family, go into every hospital, even the places that were considered to be closed areas where no people would be allowed in order to avoid the transmission of the disease. He would still visit them, give them his blessing. He would perform there was a scene when, after traveling kayaks and reaching a certain village, the first thing that he did, he climbed almost a steep hill where the cemetery was based, and he would perform the prayer for the dead there, kind of commemorating the people that were living there, that were the relatives of the Christian Indians and Aleuts, etc. So he was greatly respected, and there's some key achievements that are listed here with regards to Vladika's efforts. So the number of parishes from 15 increased to 75. There was a quite significant event when several thousand of uniates immigrants from the Carpathian Ruthenia converted to Orthodoxy. Actually, the Church of the Holy Trinity in Chicago, that was built in 1903, became a part of Russian Orthodox Church, and hence it was listed as one of the churches that were basically kind of gained in the process. Vladika knew English very well, and he was engaged in the professional translation of Orthodox liturgical books, the service books, the prayer books, and also there was a very large body of work done in translating the divine Orthodox services of the Orthodox Church into the English. And for that, actually, he received an honorary doctor of theology from the University of Wisconsin, because people considered this effort, this input, to be of great benefit in the spiritual development of the United States of America. He did suggest and receive the support in changing the status of the missionary, not from just the diocese to the exarchate of the Russian Church in North America. And the reason for that, because Vladika was actually a bishop for Christians, for Orthodox Christians with quite different backgrounds. It would not just be the Russian immigrants or immigrants from the Eastern Europe, but also there would be Greek, Syrian people, people from the Near East, and he was being quite cautious when he tried to approach the traditions that are already settled in certain parishes. He would not try and go with a single ruler and try to match that everything would be the same across the board, but he was even writing this in the letter, saying that we have to be very careful in respecting the way the Christianity, the Orthodoxy has been developing on this huge continent, and not to go in and try by implementing your own rules, try to destroy it. So there was a significant achievement in building St. Nicholas Cathedral in New York, which was finished in 1905, and from there on the cathedral, the Episcopal Cathedral from San Francisco, was moved to New York. There was a St. Tikhon's Monastery built in 1906 in the states of Pennsylvania, in South Canaan, that was blessed in the honor of St. Tikhon of Moscow. And also one of the very important events that took place in the Northern America was the first American Pan Council held in 1907. So there was a great request and interest in having something similar in the Imperial Russia as well, but it seems that it was much easier to implement this in the America, in the States, and unfortunately Vladika was not able to participate throughout the entirety of this event, because he was able to open it, but in the 1907 he was actually requested to be moved back to the Imperial Russia, to Yaroslavl, and this is where he received the new assignment to look after the cathedral in Yaroslavl. So if we can move to the next page. So Vladika spent 7 years in Yaroslavl, and that time of his life, although he did very specifically mention that the life in San Francisco specifically was basically one of the best years of his life in his serving, but the life in Yaroslavl was pretty calm as well. When he moved back, he was met in Yaroslavl by his great Bishop of Uglich, Eusebius Grozdov, and basically the entirety of the railway station where he was coming was filled up with people. So people already heard about Vladika Tikhon, and one thing I forgot to mention, that over in the United States, Vladika was elevated from the rank of bishop to archbishop. So everybody heard about the Vladika Tikhon, and people were, of course, desiring to meet him and to see him. And one of the things that Vladika did mention when he was greeted by people after the liturgy, he said, "I see that a great amount of you came today here not just because of your mere, interest or of some other reasons, but he is saying that I know that you came here in the first place because you have care and interest for your church and for the people that serve in it. So with regards to that, Vladika was trying to spare some time for everybody, especially considering teachers and professors, the people that would be reporting into him, that he would be looking after from the seminaries and places like that. So for that he was greatly respected as well. That he was trying to establish personal contacts with his basically friends and colleagues and people from the clergy. And there was quite an eventful moment as well during his service in Yaroslavl. There was a celebration of 300 celebration of the Romanos family, and for that reason the royal family and Tsar Nikolai II with his family visited the Yaroslavl in 1913. And Vladika, you can see in the image there that Vladika was greeting them. Vladika served, of course, the liturgy and said the words of blessing to the family. There was only one slight occasion during his service in Yaroslavl where that kind of casted a bit of a shadow in terms of his experience. There was a person by the name of Durnovo. He was a church publicist, and he was kind of trying. There was a situation where he had a friend who was archimandrite, and he was very interested in getting the place in Yaroslavl Cathedra, and it was the Vladika Tikhon who received it. So that friend of his, he was trying to do a small of a campaign in the newspaper, trying to make a scene, let's say, out of this, but eventually it all faded away. It turned into nothing. And one of the things that Vladika also was quite involved in while serving in Yaroslavl is that he would go about the diocese and into even the smallest towns, and he would visit the clergy and and their families, and he would personally ask about the situation in the family, how the children are being raised, what is the financial situation, and he would not neglect, the offer of some simple meal or a cup of tea. So, and there is a very funny story associated with that when Vladika was in the Pashikhonska wilderness, he went to this very small parish of a newly ordained priest and a young Matushka, his wife. And when they accepted, so they invited him over into their house, and after spending some time there, it was time for Vladika to move on. And as a tradition, normally when a guest leaves the house, at that time they would bring out a tray, a silver tray, with a shot of drink for the road, and that was considered to be obviously a common tradition. And Matushka, she was very worried, so the tray was obviously shaken, and she brought this shot to Vladika, saying, "Please don't disregard this." And Vladika, by taking, he obviously took it, started drinking, and he understood that he's drinking something very, very cheap in nature, so it wasn't really nice by taste. And Vladika said, out loud, basically, while thinking, "bitter." And in order to kind of understand the context, in Russian tradition, this is the word that is being shouted by the guests during the wedding. And when somebody says bitter, it means that the bride and the groom are meant to kiss each other. So by hearing that, the young Matushka almost dropped the tray and started running towards her husband, the young priest, and kissed him with all her heart. And everybody were astonished, even the Matushka, the father. And Vladika, by seeing that, he only smiled and said, "And this is how you should live the rest of your life." So there was no confusion whatsoever on his behalf. So you can understand the type of a person he was. And quite interestingly, that after the visit of the royal family and Tsar Nikolai, Vladika was actually moved from Yaroslavl into Vilnius, and he basically substituted the Archbishop Agafangel Preobrazhensky. And there was an interesting comment then later on made by Archpriest Alexander Rozdestvensky, who was an immigrant then after the revolution. He said that it was quite common for the government to try and rotate bishops because they would not like them to be kept in a single place for far too long, especially when people started to like them, because that means you have a person with influence in the area that if something happens, it's much more difficult to move him then further on. So Vladika was moved to Vilnius in 1914. And one of the greatest things that he did, only entering his cathedra, during the service, he said the words that, "I recognize the full difficulty of the episcopal ministry in this diverse and multi-ethnic region, and I ask you for your assistance in my ministry." So basically here, a man who is an archbishop, a man of certain power, already he has a quite strong name and people respect him, and the first thing that he does, he asks for help. So this is really shows the level of his development in terms of his spiritual development and how wise that person was. And unfortunately, Vladika was not able to serve in Vilnius for far too long because, you know, the beginning of the First World War, and because the front started moving closer to the region of the Baltics, Vladika had to basically evacuate. He also took the relics of Saint John, Antony, and Eustathius, the Vilnius martyrs, and he moved them to Moscow. So basically, after that, when moving to Moscow, Vladika also becomes a member of the Holy Synod, and he was also engaged in one situation there that he was able to resolve in a very efficient manner. That even Tsar Nicholas II wrote him a personal letter thanking him for it. There was a situation about the relics of the Holy Ioann of Tobolsk, and the bishop that was the ruling bishop in that period, because the Saint Ioann was not yet canonized, but they were trying to act as if he was already canonized. So there was a bit of a mix-up that ended up to be a significant scandal. So Vladika was able, with a mission to Tobolsk, to basically set everything in order, and by that he was greatly, yes, respected, even by receiving the letter from the Tsar. So we can move to next page, perhaps. So, but, you know, in that period, when Vladika was already in Moscow, certain activities and turbulations were afoot, and we know that the situation that in March, the Emperor Nicholas II, after the February Revolution, he had to basically pass on his power into the provisional government when he abdicated from the throne. And you can see one of the well-known paintings portraying him at the Dno station near Pskov, where the documents were signed. And hence, this is the way the new government, the republic, as they were hoping, would be developed. And one of the people amongst all of these ministers that can be seen was the Oberprosecutor Lvov, that basically substituted another person, the protege of Rasputin, that was basically quite active before him. And this man, by no other means, was also trying to implement their own ideas and initiatives. So one thing that Lvov started doing, he was quite active in putting the existent bishops and archbishops and metropolitans by putting them off cathedra by retiring them. So in order to be able to, as I mentioned, to implement their own kind of targets and ideas. So Metropolitan Makary Porniski-Nevsky, the Metropolitan of Moscow, that way was basically retired by the initiative of Lvov. And this is how the Moscow Cathedral became idle. And after certain initiatives on the part of the Holy Synod, Vladika Tikhon was actually selected by a vote to become the new metropolitan. Well, he was the Archbishop of Moscow, and during also this process, the Holy Synod announced the beginning of the preparation for the local council that was long awaited for. And it was decided that the council would open in Moscow during the Feast of the Remission of the Mother of God, and before that, Archbishop Tikhon and Archbishop Benjamin of Petrograd, they were both elevated to the ranks of metropolitans. So we can move on to the next slide. So some of the dates are actually the dates from the old calendar, so don't get confused. So you can see the image, the way the Red Square looked on the opening day of All Russian Local Council. The bells were ringing all the time. There were processions with the holy icons, with the crosses, because it was considered to be a great event. A total of 564 members were elected to be, to become members of this council, and it included, apart the obvious members of the synod and the ruling bishops, also the abbots from Lavra, the abbots from the monasteries of Alam, Solovetsk, Sarov, and Optina, and actually some of the representatives. I believe there was a representative from the Romanian Orthodox Church as well there, and another person. I don't really currently remember exactly who that was. So the council obviously started their activity through a prayer. They visited the Lavros St. Sergius. They carried out a memorial service for the slain soldiers at the Moscow cemetery. And the situation was that during this, the first periods of the local council, the situation in the front became quite poor. There was significant losses in terms of the battles in the August and September. So the council actually came out with a statement, with a request, with a call to be praying for the events that are taking place in the front inside the country as well. So for the Feast of the Exaltation of the Holy Cross, they actually kind of introduced a 3-day penitential fast before the actual feast. So calling people to stop the inner bloodshed, to stop the division, and this was one of the worries as well, because as I already mentioned, people really wanted for this local council to happen because they felt that there was a lot of questions that were needed to be addressed. And there was like a lot of initiatives that people wanted to implement within the church. And one of the worry was that because all of the revolutionary ideas that were filling basically the environment, that this type of ideas would also penetrate within the church, and that instead of the constructive council, people will have a constant division and basically, situations when one group of people is trying to implement their own ideas versus the other people. And yes, on the plenary session in October, Bishop Mitrofan of Astrakhan basically announced the main event of the local council, which initially was not the main event, but throughout the first months it became very apparent that the main question that should be addressed and should be resolved is the re-establishment of the patriarchate in the Russian Church. So next slide, please. So there is, before the actual selection and the votes, after it was considered a necessity, after it was decided that yes, we have to reestablish the patriarchate, the military activity already started in Moscow. So Petrograd has fallen, the provisional government was arrested, and there was a siege of Kremlin. And after the siege has fallen and the units that were inside there capitulated, the whole procession with Metropolitan Tikhon tried to access the churches within the Kremlin just to assess the amount of damage that has been carried out, because they were, during the fighting, the opposite sides used artillery, so there were barrages, and obviously churches had been damaged. So by trying to enter into the territory of Kremlin, initially they were rejected access. So they basically tried to kind of justify the reason for enter, and upon initial rejection, one of the guards said, well, let them in, and then we'll have the reason to shoot them. So basically they were trying to make it as a joke. So eventually they were denied access from one gate, but they were able to, at the Nikolsky gate, but they were able to gain access from Spassky gate. And they were able to assess the condition of the St. Basil's Cathedral, the Dormition Cathedral, and the Church of the Holy 12 Apostles. And there were significant damage down to the latter. There was a black hole gap on the domes of the Dormition Cathedral, and obviously the St. Basil had all the windows shattered, etc. And of course, in the places where the shells were able to penetrate inside into the building, there were a significant amount of damage made there. So after assessing this and continuing the work, on November the 5th of the 8th or the 18th, depending on the way you look at it, there was a vote carried out, and the idea behind the voting system was such that every member writes 3 names on the obviously the piece of paper, and the 3 of them who got the most of the votes then are being selected by a chance. So their names are being written separately. They put into the special wooden box, and this is basically how it ended up happening. 3 of the candidates, Archbishop Anthony Kropovitsky, Archbishop Arseniy Stadnitsky, and Metropolitan Tikhon were selected as the first 3 candidates. And then on the November the 5th, as I mentioned, in the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Moscow, after the hours, Metropolitan Vladimir of Kiev, he took the names, he personally wrote the names, he put them in a special relic box, put them before the icon of, the Vladimir icon of Holy Theotokos, and during the liturgy actually it wasn't the original one, the original icon was brought from the Dormition Cathedral, and before it that box was kept, it was sealed as well, and after the liturgy, Metropolitan Vladimir opened it up, and he gave the honor of taking out the vote to Hermon Galaxy, and that was a hermit from the Sima Hermitage. So he was basically dressed in his full garments in mantilla, and after praying before the miraculous icon, he took out one of the papers on which the name of Archbishop Tikhon was written, and hence a new patriarch of Moscow and all Russia was elected, since 1721. And here you can see an image of Archbishop Anthony Khapovitsky, who would later become the first leader of the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia. You can see Saint Tikhon, a layman, I'm not sure really who that person is, and then Archbishop Anastasy Gribanovsky, the second leader of World War. So we can move to next slide. So when Vladika, because there was an actual procession, a ceremony that came to the church where Vladika was serving liturgy on the day, and he was announced of the fact that he was elected to become a patriarch, and basically during his sermon he said that your election of me as a patriarch is for me the scroll on which was written weeping and groaning and woe, and which scroll the prophet had to eat. How many tears and groans will I have to swallow in my patriarchal service ahead of me, and especially in these difficult times? And true indeed, from the fact that Vladika died at the age of 59 only, and that from his face he was looking like a fairly old man at such a young age. You can definitely acknowledge the fact that how many tears indeed he had to shed, and how much pain and suffering he had to endure for what he was to witness down the line. So on the feast of the entry of the Most Holy Theotokos into temple in the Kremlin's Dormition Cathedral, which you can see in the image, Vladika was made a patriarch, and in his opening words, as his first words as a patriarch, he said that perhaps the gift of the patriarchate, which those stronger and more worthily than ourselves could not see, serves as an indication of God's mercy towards our weakness, our spiritual poverty. So Vladika understood, and now the patriarch understood, that this election of him is not just some blessing because he's such a great person and that he's such a spiritually developed person, but he understood that the country and the church is indeed in such a dear and weak state that God is trying to promote every help and support that he sees fit in order to overcome this challenge, this tragedy that is happening within the world and within the country itself. So next page. So from there on, an entire sequence of very serious events, historical events, started to unfold that in general can be probably called like the church and the state relationship. And I try to break it down, this entire historical period, in certain fragments, and to highlight perhaps the most obvious ones, because it is quite difficult to put such a significant amount of information and events into a single presentation, but nevertheless we'll try to highlight some of the main points. So between the 1917 and 18, and I will talk about these sections individually, but just to give you a brief idea in the first place, one of the main events was the decree of separation of the Russian Orthodox Church from the state that was pronounced by the Soviet state, and that had a very significant impact for the church, as we will see. Between the 1919 and 1920, there was a decree of uncovering the holy relics and the closure of monasteries. That also had a significant impact. There was a famine and confiscation of church valuables between 1921 and 22. And we have to also remember that during these periods, there was also a civil war ongoing within Russia. So apart from all of these kind of initiatives and difficulties and challenges, you have basically bloodshed within the family itself. So this is truly one of the most tragic episodes and the parts in the history in the Russian history. So after that, after the overcoming, the initial phases of the famine and the confiscation of church valuables, another problem became quite apparent and quite significant was the movement of so-called renovationists that were trying to basically implement a parallel church structure to the original church, and also in order to implement this, in order to be successful in it, by gaining support from the state, there were a significant amount of trials and arrests of ruling bishops and of the clergy and of the believers altogether. And eventually, closer to the last years of his life, when Patriarch Tikhon was released from custody because he did spend a significant time under home arrest, he was able to strengthen the church. There was a certain amount of compromise that we will also mention with the state, but he was able to save the church basically from being overtaken by the renovationists, and also his release really acted as a trigger for some of the bishops and some of the clergy that actually moved to the living church, as they were calling themselves, of renovationists, to move back to the mother church through the repentance. So if we go to the next slide. So these are quite busy slides because the amount of events that took place was quite significant, and unfortunately, I think you can read it on the you can read certain words on the laptop, but you cannot read it here. So to start off with, we have to mention that because of the decree, Russian and even before the decree, Russian Orthodox Church lost all of the educational institutions due to the closure, so by the state. By the end of the 1917, when things only kind of started to unfold, the first thing that was done, that all the institutions were taken from the church, so you were no longer able to teach children in the faith. Following to that, in January, the second session of the council started because there were obviously gaps and breaks between them. And that's where the decree of the separation of the Orthodox Church from the state came into place. And basically that meant that the church no longer received the financial support from the state. There was no subsidies. And of course, the properties that belonged to the church originally, they were now considered to be public property. So the church had no longer right for it. In January, there was also, because of the separation, the falling apart of the entire country into different, into different entities. One of which being, Ukraine. There was also attempts of schism being created there, and because of that, Patriarch already then, Patriarch Tikhon asked Metropolitan Vladimir to move back to Kiev in order to take the situation under control. Otherwise, there was a great risk of those schismatics to take over the church in Kiev. And while he was able to do that before January, the Red Army had entered Kiev, and on the same day, as we know, Metropolitan Vladimir, he was first arrested, moved out not far from the town, from the city, and then he was basically murdered there in cold blood. And in order to be able to take the situation under control with everything unfolding, and I'm talking about the civil war, the Bolsheviks, of course, they had to get some resources from somewhere, and it is very difficult to be fighting the civil war and be fighting the World War on two fronts at the same time when the empire is actually being collapsed. So one thing that they did was the signing of the Brest-Litovsk peace treaty with Germany, due to which the country has lost such territories like Poland, Finland, all of the Baltic region, with Lithuania, part of Belarus, Ukraine, Crimea, Georgia, and some of the cities like Batumi, Kars, and Ardahan. And also there were certain financial implications as well, but actually the words that are listed here are the words of Patriarch, who actually said that this peace treaty is not a reason to be celebrating, addressing the Russian flock, but he was saying that this is rather a reason to pray and to cry because of the outcomes of all of that. This is by no means a victory for us, by no means. And apart from this event, so the council obviously had to respond to these events in one way or another, and there was a resolution which called on measures necessitated by the ongoing persecution of the Orthodox Church, which meant that basically there was a ruling to include certain prayers during the service going forward for the church, for the persecuted church, and then there was also an annual commemoration prayer was told to be held in the name of those that have been persecuted by the state. And we all know that after that, in July of 1918, the execution of the Tsar family happened, which you can see in the image there. And the way it was introduced into the public, the state did not tell that the entire family has been murdered. They only mentioned that Tsar Nikolai II was shot. And even that alone, of course, was such a tremendous news to not only the Russian Church, not only to Russian people, but the entire world as well. And basically in here, in these words that we're not able to cite now, but what Patriarch was saying from his cathedra, from the Anvon, during the sermon, saying that we cannot accept this act of cruelty, this crime, and we have to call it the way it is, because it is more important for us to listen to the Word of God and to say that when we see an evil act, that we need to witness that it is an evil act. Otherwise, if we stay silent and calm, we will be the partakers of it. We will be like partners in crime. So he basically came out and stood against the Soviet state in this activity by understandable reasons. And eventually that of course drew attention from initially drew attention from the state, and then afterwards when Vladika Patriarch Tikhon sent a message to the Council of Peoples of Commissars when they were commemorating the anniversary of the revolution, basically when they overtook the power. He was asking them the questions, consider what you have promised to people and compare it with what you're giving to them in the real life. You told them that you would give them a bread, but you gave them a stone, and etc. So he was saying that either fulfill your promises and stop this meaningless bloodshed, or obviously, we have to come out and to witness against your unprecedented cruelty. And after this message, Vladika was arrested. Saint Tikhon was arrested for the first time. So we can go to the next page. Okay, so moving forward, moving forward to the further years of 1919 and 1920, we witnessed the situation when the state issued a decree ordering the uncovering of the relics to be organized and basically to be documented by the special commissions in the presence of clergy. And of course, it was understandable that this is another attempt to push the church, the believers, into protecting their relics, their valuables, and using this as a pretext to putting more pressure on performing more arrests, basically making church to yield to this to the new state. And of course, Saint Tikhon had to respond in this case as well. He was writing directly to the state, saying that any insult to the religious feelings of the people will invoke natural grief, trying to call to their common sense, and justifiable indignation, and may even agitate them to an incomparably greater degree than all other adversities in life. The uncovering of relics obliges us to stand in defense of the desecrated shrine. So basically, Patriarch was trying to reason with the state, saying that by doing so, you're actually promoting violence and mischief and people standing against you rather than supporting you. But of course, the state didn't really take into consideration his calling. Patriarch did try to also send a decree to bishops that kind of encouraged them to assess the relics before the actual commission, try to hide some of them, etc. But in certain places it was not really possible to do that without certain danger, because everything was really kept a close eye on, and by doing so people can just ended up getting arrested. And in similar fashion, these words were addressed when the state declared that they want to open up the relics of Saint Sergius of Radonish, but as I mentioned, they didn't really pay attention to it, so they still do it in any way. And in this image, you can see the uncovering of relics of Saint Seraphim of Sarov that were actually kept then that were later found. They were kept away, and then they were later found by also almost like a miraculous way. There was in July, so in the summer of 1919, there was an assassination attempt on Patriarch Tikhon after the service, when he was accompanied by his clergy. One woman from the crowd came out with a knife, and she tried to, she stabbed him on his side. And initially, of course, everybody were quite shocked and were afraid that there was a significant deal of damage done to Patriarch, but it was actually a flesh wound, so Patriarch recovered from it quite swiftly. And the lady was, yes, obviously one of the followers of the revolutionary idea, so she was from the Bolsheviks background and running the ideology. So this is obviously why she tried, because Patriarch Tikhon was considered to be like one of the greatest threats by the state, because of the great support that he was receiving from the people, despite the propaganda and the atheistic initiatives that were, as we can see, were being implemented by the state. So later on, Vladika was called, yes, for the interrogation at the extraordinary commission, and upon his replies, one thing, he was questioned by a person called by the surname Latsis, the serviceman, and when he was questioned, Vladika said that my attitude towards the Soviet government is exactly the same as that set out in the message to the people's commissars on the occasion of the first anniversary of the October Revolution, and can only be changed if the government itself changes its attitude towards the church. So we see that Patriarch was not trying to escalate the situation, he was not trying to make it worse, he was just saying that we are willing to be supporting the government in the case if the government is actually acting with respect and supports church as well at the same time. And then following by the arrest of the Patriarch and by keeping him away from the public, in 1920 there was great deal of monasteries that started to be closed. So Savino-Starozevsky Monastery, the Holy Trinity Lavra, St. Sergius, the Yury of Novgorod Monastery, and actually these are quite the famous ones, but much more were closed down. And because of the situation, basically the Patriarch, the Holy Synod, and the All-Russian Central Council, they had to adopt a resolution that allowed the self-government of the diocese in the situation when they cannot maintain contact with the canonical center. And this was quite important because it was very easy to become kind of feeling that you're left alone, that you're no longer tied to the center, and that can become a reason for various manipulations going down the road. So we can move on to the next slide. And if things seem to be quite bad up to this stage with the civil war, with the church persecution, in the summer of 1921, because of the very serious drought in the Volga region, entire regions like in Urals, the Caucasus Crimea, and the southern Ukraine, famine broke out there, and eventually it impacted over 34 Russian provinces, and the extent was so significant that around 20 million people were actually suffering from the famine. Around 2 million people have died of it, and there was, because of that, there was approximately 1 million children that left orphans because of that. And people who were able to witness that moment in history were saying that it was such a heartbreaking scene that you would be coming into villages that will be completely empty, and you will be seeing processions when people were trying to leave with whatever belongs. They would have to try and move to the provinces where there were no famine, and people would die along the road, and the entirety of the roadside would be basically covered with bodies. So this is something that you don't of course see in a normal life and can just neglect it. And by seeing the situation, of course, Patriarch Tikhon, as a head of church, did not want to remain silent. He called out for help, and he would basically reach out to the entire world, asking for support. You know, he obviously addressed the Pope of Rome. He addressed the Bishop of Canterbury, the head of English Church, and different world leaders. And of course, the entire world did respond. There was a great deal of support, and in terms of money and food being sent. And in order to implement this, there was so-called Pomgol committee created, who was chaired by a patriarch, that was kind of initiated also through the help of Kalinin and Maxim Gorky, one of the famous writers of that period. But seeing this initiative, the state decided to take over. So basically Pomgol was abolished, and a different committee, it was replaced by the State Central Commission for Aid to the Starving. And basically all of the provision that was received, it was confiscated. Here you can see an old picture that states the support from Lithuania to the the starving people of Russia. And in order to overcome this problem, of course, the government saw an opportunity to do this through trying to confiscating the valuables from the churches that historically has been, of course, accumulated in in different icons, because and different items, church items, because of the nature of the items themselves. You know, there were precious stones and the gold and silver being used during the process of them being made. And because of that, the government has issued a decree for the procedure of confiscating these valuables. And on the one hand, Patriarch was, of course, in this situation more than happy to support people and to support the state by giving these valuables, because what worth gold or gems in a situation when people are dying of hunger? But he could not accept the fact that the liturgical items would be confiscated, because it would go against the church canons, and he also had to come out with a statement saying that we're happy to support, but we cannot allow to these specific liturgical items to be confiscated. And that, of course, caused standoffs between the people that were involved in confiscations and people, the believers that would try and protect these holy items. And this is where the precedent was set. There was a situation in Shuya where protesters, they were armed really lightly, I mean, with some clubs and spikes, but they basically chased off the initial committee that came in to try and perform the confiscation. So they had to call in the military, and when the military came in, they actually opened fire and they shot several people. I think it was 5 people killed and over 20 were wounded. And this is the situation that Lenin saw as a great opportunity to try and implement the very heavy and ruthless, really, attempt to force the church to follow the state's laws, the policies, basically just to yield to whatever requirement the state throws at it. And this is what Lenin actually wrote in a secret letter, that there was no copies allowed to be taken, and people that were involved had to put their signatures on the only single, basically the original. And he was saying that it's precisely now, when famine reigns in the country, that we must carry out the confiscation of church valuables with the most frenzied and merciless energy, and not hesitate to suppress any resistance. The greater the number of representatives of the reactionary clergy that must be shot, the better. So, and this is what happened further. Go to the next page. This is what happened further, because technically the third section, the session of the council was already closed by that state. And the government tried to use the precedent in Shuya to start different trials across the country. It's been in Moscow and also in Petrograd, where they tried to carry out as many death sentences as possible. So in April, there was so-called the Polytechnic Museum trial, where 20 Moscow priests and 34 laymen were put on trial. And of course, Saint Patriarch, he used his position in order to file a request to substitute the death sentences, and in a way it was satisfied. I believe that there was at least 5 people that were taken off. They were spared their life. They obviously got sentences, but they were not shot. But still, there were, because of that, of this trial, the number of clergy and the bishops involved, they were shot. So it became like a standard practice, and in the process of this being done, the renovationist movement started to grow in its number, and they basically tried to persuade Patriarch Tikhon to hand over the control of the church, the documentation, everything that is involved onto them. And initially what has happened is that Vladika said that he's willing to sign the documents and basically delegate his role to other existing, obviously, members of the church, but not anybody from the renovationist movement. And they really tried to use the situation to play it out in such a way that by having the document that he signed to his fellow archbishops and metropolitans, to use it in a way, in such conditions that have not been basically formally captured in these documents. So one of the things that they tried to do when Patriarch Tikhon was placed under arrest in Donskoy monastery, they tried to approach the Metropolitan Benjamin of Petrograd, and that was done by Krasnitsky, and he was trying to persuade him also to support the renovationist movement. But what Metropolitan Benjamin did instead, during the service in Petrograd, he firmly proclaimed that anybody who's involved with renovationists, they're outside the church, because these people are schismatics, they have nothing to do with the real church. And surely enough, after this, Metropolitan Benjamin was sentenced. He was arrested and sentenced, and there was a famous Petrograd churchman trial that involved 86 people, including the Metropolitan himself. And we know the outcome of that was kind of carried out deliberately. That was like a demonstrative trial to show that if you come forth against the state, if you will try to oppose the ideas that we try to implement, this is what you're going to face. And we know that Metropolitan Benjamin was executed. He was shot because of his stance. The last thing that he did, he returned his white klobuk, and he said that I'm returning through the person he was given to. He said, please tell that I'm returning it undefiled. So I'm returning it as white as I received it, basically, saying, obviously talking about his conscience. At the same time, when the trial was ongoing, there was an attempt to try and take control over the renovationist movement by signing the Memorandum of Three. So Bishop Sergius of Vladimir, Evdokim of Nizhny Novgorod, and Serafim of Kostroma, they kind of signed the document confirming the legitimacy of the renovationist movement. And the idea was that because they were quite high-ranking bishops, that they would be able to take control of this movement and to try to stir it to the right direction. But eventually, both of them, the Sergius and Serafim, I believe, they were able to understand that it was quite a great mistake on their behalf, because they gave a reason for people within the church that were stayed with Patriarch, and the people that maybe were, for certain reasons, moved to renovationists, to basically continue spreading the arguments, continue spreading the division. And of course, some people might have been tempted by it and actually joined also the renovationist movement. But as I said already before, that the two of the hierarchs there, they did repent after it and rejoined the church. What has happened in the process, that because of the support from the state, the renovationists were able to form, of course, their like a branch of church hierarchy. They gained control of great deal of churches, and actually out of the, I believe it was 74 or 76 bishops at the time, more than half of them actually joined the renovationist movement, because that was the way things were evolving. And one thing that they attempted of doing, the renovationists, they tried to hold the All Russian Congress well, they did hold the All Russian Congress of White Clergy, and then they tried and actually ran the second All Russian Local Council, by which they were trying to basically retire Saint Tikhon. They basically made a statement during that council that the Patriarch has betrayed the gospel and the canonical teaching of the Church because of his anti-revolutionary activity, etc., etc., and that because of that he basically been stripped of his rank, of his monastic tonsuring vows, and they came with a letter to him, actually in the May of 1923, and Vladika, the Saint Tikhon, Saint Patriarch, he read it, and he wrote basically on the resolution saying, "I have read it, the council did not summon me, I do not know its jurisdiction, and therefore I cannot recognize its decision as legal. Patriarch Tikhon Vasily Belavin, April 25, 1923. So we see that despite the situation, he was standing firm and was not willing, of course, to submit to this group of to the group of people that were just trying to use the opportunity and to for their own personal reasons. Here you see Evgeny Tuchkov. He was the main prosecutor from the state, so he was basically looking like an prosecutor in the Russian Empire. He would be taking care of the matters, everything related to the church, and he would be, of course, putting a lot of pressure on Patriarch when trying to implement the ideas associated with the changes within the church. And in here you can see that Vedensky. Vedensky was the so-called former, the new patriarch from the Renovationists. He was one of the leaders of the movement initially, but he was, of course, he was an archpriest at the time before the whole revolution started in the first place. So we can move to the next page. And because seeing the situation, as I mentioned, because seeing how the great deal of bishops actually given up, submitting to the Renovationist movement, and after for a significant amount of time spent in the GPU prison, Patriarch Tikhon decided that he will come to a certain compromise with the state in order to be able to help the church. So basically he was charged with certain crimes, as the state stated it, that he was basically going against the state by his messages, by his in his speeches that he was given, and he had to admit it, accept it, and he had to write a petition saying that from now on I'm no longer an enemy of Soviet state. I finally and decisively dissociated myself from both the foreign and domestic monarchists, White Guard counter-revolutions. So that message was quite a shock, especially to the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, what is to become the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia further down the line. And people, some saw it as a betrayal, some saw it as an attempt actually to save the church within Russia. And this is what Patriarch responded to whenever he would be presented with this type of accusations. He would say that, "Let my name perish from history if only the church benefits from it." There was an event when the Archpriest Krasnitsky, the one that I already mentioned to you, there were a situation when he probably got into conflict with the members of the living church. So he lost his position and he tried to regain the connection with the actual church, but only on his terms. And while initially Patriarch Tikhon, there were meetings and councils, kind of small councils being held because of that, one of the released bishops saw Patriarch, and he said, "Please, in the sake, for the sake of the church and everything that you're doing, please do not accept any proposals, any propositions from these group of people, because that will obviously hurt the church more than it will do the benefit." And then Patriarch responded by saying, "Well, I'm really suffering, really worried about the situation in which our church and both the clergy are ending up, and you can see yourself what is happening." And then the bishop mentioned that, well, the only thing that we're good for nowadays is to actually be spending time in prison. So basically saying that you should not consider these things with regards to ourselves, but rather just be thinking about the church. And this is what Saint Tikhon actually wrote then in one of the letters, confirming that all of those negotiations, all of those initiatives, they were broken. The terms of Krasnitsky were rejected, and Patriarch wrote that, "Please believe that I will not make agreements and concessions that will lead to the loss of the purity and strength of orthodoxy." But after this letter, the initial letter, he was released from custody. The guards were removed from Donskoy Monastery, and the first thing that Saint Tikhon did, on the same day he was released, he went to the cemetery where Saint Alexei Michov of Moscow was buried on the same day. And of course, when people saw their patriarch, they were very happy. And the first liturgy that when he served, the entirety of the church was full, and even outside there was no space for people to be standing. So seeing that how much support Saint Tikhon was receiving from the flock, and also upon the release, a great mass of clergy started returning from the renovationist schism to the church. And also you can see in here Metropolitan Sergei, who initially signed that letter of 3, the memorandum. He had to publicly confess, and during the confession he received his garments back from Saint Tikhon. And there was an interesting, very touching moment when after the Metropolitan Sergei was fully restored in his rank, Saint Tikhon would take him by the beard and ask him, "So, you old fool, you also wanted to abandon me?" And of course, that was very touching, that they could not hold their tears, and they kind of comforted each other. And of course, that was had a great rejoicement for people to see such a reunion and the church coming in strength. So the next slide. And of course, as with everything in our life, the life of Saint Patriarch Tikhon came to an end. He was really sick in the last year. It was even difficult for him to stand during the service. But although he was in the hospital, he would still come on Sundays to serve. And basically, the last liturgy that he served was actually the Palm Sunday. And it seemed that Patriarch already knew that it was his last service, but the way he was serving it, he was very focused, very calm, and people noted that. There were, because he was in the clinic, there was, I think, an operation, tooth extraction, and he received a shot of morphine before. And on the day as well, as he was in that hospital, he asked for another shot, and he was very weak. He went for a sleep, and then when he woke up, it was 11:45 when he asked for the time, which time it is. And when he was told which time it is, he made an attempt to make a holy sign cross, saying, "Glory to thee, O God, glory to thee." And on the third time, he was not able to finish it because he has passed into eternity. And that happened, as we know, on the 7th of April, the 25th of March, during the feast of the Annunciation of the Holy Theotokos. And that, of course, event itself, the funerals of the Patriarch, held a great amount of people. It is told that approximately 300,000 people came to his funeral. There was a non-stop coming of people, and when eventually the panihida was served and the coffin had to be moved from one place to another, deliberately people were asked not to move, not to try and make attempt to like follow the procession or anything, because a single event could cause a disaster of such a magnitude that if people start falling on each other, etc., that instead of a glorious witnessing of a holy man passing into the eternity, it would be just another tragic moment. So, and people, for the entirety of the service and the entirety of the burial procession and ceremony, everybody were standing firm, nobody moved anywhere. And it is also known that our Vladika, if you move to the next slide, was canonized in 1989 in October in Rokor. It happened a bit earlier, several years. And then, again, very miraculously, his relics were found in 1992 in Donskoy Monastery. There is a story about it written by Tikhon of Moscow, he was not obviously a metropolitan at that time. He was archimandrite, I think, in the books of unholy saints, Nesvety Svety. I don't know if you have read the book. So there was actually a tomb within the tomb, because initially when they started looking for his grave and they were able to find the marking that Patriarch Tikhon rests there, when they opened it up, it was completely empty, so they thought that the relics were actually destroyed by the Soviet government, but it was actually hidden slightly deeper and on the side, so there was a great deal of rejoicing, of course, when the relics were uncovered and people got the opportunity to pray to their Patriarch. So this, I believe, brings us to the end of this presentation. It took a while, sorry, but it's just the amount of information. I probably have left a great deal outside with regards to the names that people were executed and the names of people that played a significant role throughout this period. And of course, I haven't touched upon the topic of all of the Russian immigrants and the clergy and the bishops outside Russia in the period of 1921-23, when there were separate churches in the country that gained independency, being basically created, the autonomous churches of Poland and of Finland, etc. It's a great deal of information on its own, so maybe next time we'll be able to talk about it, but today this is it, and if you have any questions, I guess, to ask.
Thank you so much, Father.
Thank
Do
you.
we have any questions? I have a question. So I only know a little bit about the so-called Living Church. So was some of the clergy of the Living Church, were they previously proper Orthodox clergy
Yes.
that went over? And was
Yes.
that just, were they just opportunists, or were they sympathetic to the Soviets, or what was the reason they were?
Because everybody is individual. There were many different reasons for doing that. Some, of course, people were just opportunists, and they were seeing it as an opportunity to maybe go higher in rank, to get a better position. But some people were really confused with the entire situation. Like, what do you do? Like, and because when you have the division in amongst the bishops as well, you don't know whom you have to really to listen to, especially if the people that you have been with for a long time give you a certain amount of justification, valid from their standpoint of view, why we should be joining. Otherwise there will be no church whatsoever. So it's really easy to go and start blaming somebody from the perspective of history where we are now, but it is really difficult to try and put yourself in somebody's shoes and try and see with their eyes with regards to everything that was happening. Yes, we know that the living church were schismatics. Yes, we know that it was not right to be following them, but to be judgmental, I guess, and to kind of give certain verdicts with regards to specific people, that requires a really, really deep studying of the topic. So.
Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
So you mentioned that Saint Tikhon was the first patriarch of Russia in over 200 years.
Yes.
So what was the history of patriarchy in the patriarchate of Russia over that period before Saint Tikhon? So how did that came about, and why was there no patriarch before that?
Well, because this it's of course a very broad question, and there's like certain courses in university that cover that topic. But to be put simply, when you have a strong leader in the country, he tries to control everything, and church is also one of the things that he tries to control. We have been seeing it throughout the history, right? So when Peter the First, who became the emperor, who made Russia an empire, and truly so, he was a very charismatic and very strong person from that perspective. And he decided that the church doesn't need a patriarch, because when you have a patriarch, you have you have an individual that can lead, and that he can have an opinion, and he can have an opinion quite strong that people will listen to him, and that way he becomes a political figure all of a sudden. Although he's a spiritual leader, but from the emperor's standpoint of view, he can be an opposition, and I don't need an opposition. So that way I will abolish the patriarchate. I will keep the church, but I will keep it as a part of the state. And that way I will have control over everything. And it's a good question why throughout all of these years, nobody of the following emperors were trying to reestablish the patriarchate, because it's going about the canons of the church. Nobody can be the head of the church apart the actual patriarch. So a layman cannot be the head of the church, which emperor was for a fact. Why was that a case? Well, I guess it's a difficult political question. Maybe Father Michael can answer that question. Yes, but in general, yes, it's the way. It took a revolution to re-implement the patriarchate within Russia, so it must mean that it was a quite difficult and important question, So I don't know whether that answers or not.
Any other questions?
Can I ask, when Soviets were uncovering the relics of the saints in the start of the persecution, what did they actually do with them? Is it to destroy them?
No, so the idea was to compromise that, to show people that, look, it's just a pile of bones, and there's nothing special about it. They would not necessarily destroy it. As I mentioned, for example, the relics of Saint Seraphim of Sarov, they were kept, they were found accidentally, but they were kept. They were kept basically like in a museum, and you have like this, everything would be documented. Well, most of things would be documented. Of course, there were instances when people would deliberately try and destroy the relics because of the personal hatred or some sort of position. But in general, it wasn't really like just an idea of just destroying everything. It's more rather try to ridicule the church, to say like you see everything you've been told is a lie, and
Mm.
there's nothing really here to worship. You know,
Mm.
not understanding the principle. It's not about saying that if the relic has to be like a fully preserved body, that it's not about that. The whole idea is not about that. So this is basically, as far as I understand.